Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this episode of Trade Winds. My name is Cecilia Malmström. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Today, we are going to talk about the e-commerce moratorium. This might be something you never heard about, but it is much more important than you think. It is an agreement that the WTO members made already in 1998, not to impose custom duties on electronically transmitted goods, such as ebooks, for instance. Since then, there has been a lot of discussions how to proceed. E-commerce has developed. In 98, we didn't even have iPhones. So, of course, there has been a lot of discussion. What is this moratorium actually about? It applies, as I said, to digitally delivered trade. But this moratorium will end automatically by the 31st of March next year, unless WTO ministers act before. There is an upcoming WTO ministerial in Abu Dhabi in February next year. And even if most countries of the world, there are 164 members of the WTO, agree that the moratorium has been beneficial, a few countries are now preparing to introduce duties. What would this mean for the global economy, for the digital trade, for business, and why should you care? This is what we're going to discuss today with a very qualified panel. We have Devi Ariyani, who is Executive Director for the Indonesia Service Dialogue Council, and Dr. Catherine Kuhlmann, who is Visiting Professor of Law at Georgetown University Law Center in Washington, D.C. You are both very welcome. So if you have a book on do not pay those. WTO members have agreed not to apply customs duties on that transmission. So this moratorium has helped business of all sides and in many sectors, and it has tapped into online marketing, financing, logistics applications, cloud data, processing, storage, etc. And it has also given cheap access to products for ordinary citizens. But it is a little bit blurry, and the scope of the moratorium has not been really clear. So Devi and Catherine, can you help us understand what is actually electronically transmitted goods and why is this moratorium important? Catherine, why don't you start?
Okay, thank you so much, Cecilia. Thank you for having me. It is a true pleasure to be here and to also have a chance to present with Devi again. We were together at the WTO Public Forum. I've certainly learned a lot from her. I'm looking forward to the discussion today. So let me try to unpack it a little bit. And I will start by saying it is not very clear. And it also does not have a very catchy name. The WTO moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions does not really roll off the tongue, but it certainly has a significant impact. So let me just highlight a few things that I think you touched on and raise a couple of points that I think are going to be important for us today. Since 1998, under the moratorium, WTO members have agreed by consensus, as you said, to refrain from imposing import duties on electronic transmissions. It's interesting, though, because the moratorium is different than many other trade measures. This is an agreement to completely refrain from doing something. It's not an agreement on how to approach an issue. And this is really important, I think, because there's still so much uncertainty on how we would assess what the duties should be, how they would be applied, how they would be administered. And we don't have legal disciplines in this area. They're completely lacking. And so I think we're talking about lifting something when there are no legal disciplines on how it would work if the moratorium were to be lifted. So I think that's really essential to keep in mind. I think it's also important to remember, as you noted, this is not a permanent agreement. So it has to keep getting renewed by trade ministers, the 164 countries that are part of the WTO at each WTO ministerial conference. The last time that this happened was in June 2022. For the 12th ministerial conference, we now have another one coming up in February. If that conference gets delayed, we only have until the end of March to make a decision on the moratorium, or it has to go to the General Council to make a decision on extending it. So it's pretty timely that we're having this discussion too. And you mentioned as well that there's a debate on the scope. So we don't even have definitions of what electronic transmissions mean. I mean, I think it's very difficult to kind of navigate this when we're not even sure what we're talking about. So electronic transmission usually is interpreted to mean digitally delivered trade, cross-border digital delivery. We talk about products like computer programs and video images and sound recordings, and sometimes services also come up. Although there has been, I think, some more discussion in the regional arena on how this gets defined. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. But the discussion really has centered on the scope. Would the imposition of customs duties apply to the content that's transmitted electronically, i.e. the good or service, or just the transmission, the digital delivery of the good and service? And so again, there's some work done regionally that kind of helps illuminate where that might go. A lot of focus also is on the revenue implications. And you mentioned the recent OECD study. There have been several other studies. UNCTAD has done several studies, but these studies are really interesting because they have very different approaches and they have very different projections on what revenue loss will look like. The studies that Devi and I have worked on focus more on the impact on small businesses, which I think is an aspect of this that sometimes gets overlooked. And so I just want to say the last thing about this is that I think that part is really important. So we talked about how the trade community interprets this and how we generally understand this. And even within the trade community, we don't really have a good understanding of what this is. For most others, this is a complete unknown. And I think that aspect is really important. So we've been talking so much about inclusion. I co-direct a center at Georgetown Law School on inclusive trade and development. This term inclusion I see coming up everywhere. It's coming up in WTO documents. The Director General is mentioning it. And it has significant implications for this discussion. But I just want to mention two really quick things that my nonprofit organization called New Markets Lab, which is like a legal think tank, has done on this, just really quickly about awareness among MSMEs. I'll talk more about the study later, but the awareness part I think is really important. And so the substantial majority, we talked to almost 300 companies, the substantial majority, about 65%, were not at all aware of the moratorium, had no idea that it existed. And when they heard about it, became quite, concerned that this was something that was really going to impact them. About 3/4 of them were not consulted by their governments about a possible imposition of import tariffs on electronic transmissions. And I think this raises larger issues with trade policymaking, but certainly is a really significant aspect of this discussion that I know we'll get into more. So thanks again, and I look forward to the discussion.
Wow, thank you. That made us confused on a higher level, I would say. So Devi, how would you define this? Because how can we worry about something disappearing when we don't really know what it covers?
Yes, I think I support what Catherine has just conveyed. There's no common understanding in terms of what is electronic transmitted goods, what scope that does it entails, and what's the definition of digital goods. However, in the absence of, or in the limited understanding of what is electronic transmitted goods, I can only refer to the classification of digital goods that is currently being defined and set by the Indonesian Ministry under the Excise Code of 99. And under that Excise Code 99 of the Indonesia Ministry regulation, the digital goods are classified as operating system software, application software, multimedia, audiovisual, supporting driver data for machinery system, and other digital goods and software. So this entails quite a broad range of digital goods that are currently being used by businesses, whether it's large-scale businesses or micro-scale businesses. So of course, then it becomes a concern if there is a tariff involved in accessing or adopting these digital goods. How will they then impacting the businesses of the SMEs particularly, and how they actually use it? So I think that's the basis of our initial studies, because we initiated the studies to see the depth of the adoption of digital goods, and also the how they use it and how it impacted the business. With regards to digital goods, I think we can only see there are three potential impacts here for the businesses. The first one, if there's no tariff, and there's only, let's say, if there's no tariff, but there's a compliance that is imposed to the businesses in terms of declaring digital goods that are being used. So that implies there's an administrative burden that's currently being passed on to the businesses in order to comply, and there is administrative cost as well as compliance costs that the businesses has to endure with regards to this new requirement. And secondly, if there is a tariff above 0%, that means there's a raised cost in terms of production costs, which potentially affecting the or reducing the competitiveness of Indonesian businesses to export. And the third potential impact is there's a rise of the fragmented policies in different economies, which means this will be difficult for businesses to do the planning if each economy is imposing different tariff and how the businesses would operate under such uncertainties. So I think these three key impacts is what makes it really important for us to really narrow down what is actually defined as the electronic transmitted goods, what is the scope of it, because we can see then we can properly measure the impact of digital goods if we know already what's the definition and the scope of digital goods.
I have been present at a few ministerials in WTO, and this has always been very controversial. But in the end, there has been a decision so far to prolong the moratorium. But it seems like we have like two important tasks here. First, to prolong the moratorium because clock is ticking right now. But also we need to come to terms with the definitions of this. Because, I mean, digital trade is so much, and there's also the whole digital service and all the apps. And some of them benefit from this moratorium because they sort of squeeze in their own definition, and some don't. So how can we go about here? Because this is a much more important and difficult task, of course, to define really what should be included and not. Because as things have developed since '98, there has been a lot of things happening in the area. What do you think, Devi?
Yeah, I think in the limited understanding or in the absence of that common understanding of what is considered and defined as electronic transmitted goods, I can only refer to the local ministry regulation, what is defined as digital goods. And under that SS Code 99, we try to see how is actually the SMEs, which comprises 98% are micro-scale businesses. And if we look at these micro-scale businesses, the 98%, 61% are women-owned businesses. And if we look further, these women-owned businesses, they typically coming from informal sectors, and they're able to get into the formal sectors because of digital goods and digital services that they adopted. Which means before they don't have a proper transaction, and now they have a proper record of transaction because of digital goods and digital services that they adopted. And they also have a proper database, customer database, because of digital goods and services that they adopted. So in this sense, digital goods and services have helped the informal sectors to be formalized. And secondly, it also helped the women entrepreneurs, which is not a business savvy person, and then it gets into the businesses, and they're able to expand their businesses because of digital goods and digital services that they adopted. We can also see that the adoption of digital goods and services, it has leveled up the playing field for the small businesses with the larger enterprises, because they have the same chance to be able to export and expand the market. So we've seen the positive impact on how actually these digital goods, either its operating system or application software or other digital services, they all have a significant positive impact to SME businesses. In terms of productivity, it increases their revenues as well as profit. It also reduces a lot of marketing costs, logistic and shipment costs. So these digital goods and services has been used as production input for businesses. And if they are used as the productivity tools, if there is import tariff being imposed, it will significantly affect their businesses, because we know that typically the SMEs have limited operating capital, they have limited network, and they don't have enough resources to be able to expand and do their business. And these digital goods and services are enabler for them to be able to expand their business and operate, especially during the pandemic.
Yes, that's very interesting. There was a study by OECD published only a couple of weeks ago where they tried to look at this and try to come up with definitions, and so highlighting the problems of this. But you would think that when you hear about digital transmitted goods, that you think about Amazons and those big companies. But OECD also actually confirms that those who benefit the most and who would lose the most are small companies, often women-led, in developing countries. And I know you have done a lot of research on this as well, Katrine. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, I'd love to share a little bit more as well on what we've looked at, both with respect to MSMEs, and then talk about some of the studies that have been done on women. And I do think at some point we might circle back to this regional trade agreement dimension of this too, because I think the more that I get into that, the more that I see that it has big implications for where this goes, like in other areas too, where there's more work being done regionally. So that's just kind of a placeholder maybe for us to go back to. But let me answer the question that you've asked, that you've posed right now. So as Devi's study has shown too, there I think will be a significant impact on small businesses. And this again, I think is something that we really need to study much more before any action is taken. I feel like the more that I have gotten into it, the more questions that I have, as you said earlier, it complicates things as you start to kind of dig into this. And that signals to me that we don't know enough to be able to make a decision on removing the moratorium. So let me share just a little bit on kind of what we have found. So Devi highlighted a little bit of this in her study too. So one thing is that the compliance costs are going to go up for MSMEs. I mean, I think that is clear. I think MSMEs are already struggling with so many things that they have to deal with. And there have been so many changes too. I think we can't forget that we, very recently concluded the trade facilitation agreement, which is a tremendous thing, but it still means that there are additional things that businesses need to take into account. And most of them, so we did the study, we focused on South Africa and Kenya as two places where when there are a lot of entrepreneurs, there's kind of this, growing tech sector and creative industry sector. We looked across 15 sectors though, too. We talked to almost 300 companies overall. We wanted to have kind of a statistically significant number of companies that we were surveying. And most of them, again, they didn't know about this. And then when they did, they realized what implications it might have for them. So just a couple of things to show, to kind of toss out there. And there have been other studies that are good on this too. Badri has a study on this that focused on India, that they're doing in other countries as well, that digitally delivered imports have a positive impact on productivity and employment. And so our study really focused on kind of awareness and impact. I would say those are the two things that we really tried to look at. We had 292 companies, so just be more precise. And as a baseline, 3/5 of them, so about 60% of them, have expressed that they have little or no capacity to comply with additional customs administrative requirements. So they feel like they are already stretched, and new customs administrative requirements would be too much, and in some cases might cause them to go out of business. The majority of them reported significant or moderate impact on potential growth due to the imposition of import tariffs and additional customs requirements. And the majority, also 61%, reported significant or moderate impact on competitiveness. So they felt like this would hit them everywhere: compliance, competitiveness, growth. Some of them also, and I can get into this a little bit more when we talk about the impact on people and consumers, a lot of them said too they were going to have to pass these costs along if they do incur them. So I think that there is going to be, that this is really going to hit these small businesses hard, and to not be engaged in the process and not have any ability to kind of help shape what this would look like, I think is really quite overwhelming. So then you asked about the gender aspect of this too, and I think that's also significant. So we know also that in most places, most of these small businesses are women. And that women in particular have really benefited from the growth in digital trade. We saw this especially during the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic. So I think that we can assume that there's going to be this significant impact on women as well. So empirically, we know that women do benefit more significantly from digital trade. In some cases, there are great studies on this as well. The ITC, for example, showing that shares of firms owned by women double when they move onto online trade from offline, kind of more traditional trade. They estimate that 3 out of 4 firms are trading exclusively through e-commerce, women-owned firms. So I think that's pretty compelling. I also read this interview earlier with Wamkele Mene, who's the Secretary General of the AFCFTA, which is something that I focused on a lot in my research. I think it's this really exciting, big new regional trade agreement. And there were a couple of things that I thought were really interesting from what he said. He said, one, first, in Africa, SMEs are run by women, account for almost 60% of GDP. 450 million jobs. So this is a huge part of Africa's growth. And he also really highlighted youth too, which I thought was something we're hardly even talking about in this, that these jobs in tech and in creative industries are jobs for young people. And we spend so much time talking about how do we get youth more engaged in trade. This is it. And here we are trying to think of something that's going to complicate that even more. So it would set this higher barrier to entry. And then the last thing I would say on the gender piece is that there's an excellent study by another group that I'm very proud to be part of, Trade Experts, on the impact of the e-commerce moratorium on women. And what they find is that the increase in cost of importing digitally delivered goods would make women-owned MSMEs less competitive. And that digitally delivered goods and services have been key to the survival of women-owned businesses. And so again, I think this is really something that we have to think about. I have a couple of stories too. I don't know if I can tell one really quickly, or if you want me to. Sure. But one of the things we're trying to do with this work too is also make it, we want it to be kind of academically sound, but we also want it to be human, because I think this is ultimately about people and how they are going to relate to this. And so one of the companies we met with was a financial services MSME in Kenya that provides microfinance using mobile-based technology to give credit to about 10 million unregistered micro enterprises. This is something that Devi had talked about before. Most of these are owned by women. And so they thought that the added costs, if there were to be customs duties imposed, would create all kinds of complexity for their end users, women and adolescent girls, and very possibly cut off these services entirely because their business operations would become more costly and make them less competitive. So I think there's like a human face to this too, which is that, and this is going to have these spillover repercussions. I mean, this example that I just gave goes into finance, microfinance, development, all of these things, again, that we keep talking about as being so important to where we go next on trade. And this is something that is going to have direct implications there. So thanks for letting me tell a quick story, and happy to continue sharing more.
No, thank you. I mean, we are talking about people, and so it's important to see the people behind the statistics. Devi, you also referred to this, that a majority of these small companies who would be affected are actually owned by women. But if we see the countries who are opposed to renew the moratorium, these are countries like Indonesia, like India, South Africa, and others. And these are countries who we know also have a large group of micro or very small companies run by women. So what is the reasoning there? Because they would obviously be affected, but how is the discussion? Can you go into that? I think you're muted.
Sorry. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. I cannot speak on behalf of Indonesian government.
Of course,
they may have their own. They may have their own reason of why they're deciding of what they're deciding now. However, let me just maybe I'm not making it clear before in my previous delivery, whereby currently digital goods it has been imposed VAT 11%. For every, if you want to access and adopt digital goods, on the price, it has been imposed VAT. So that alone, that already raises costs. If the moratorium is not continued, it would mean that there is an increased risk of what Prof. Catherine was saying earlier. There's potential risk of the increased costs, because then whatever the tariff is on top of whatever the tax that is already been imposed, the VAT that's been imposed. And secondly, if there is a tariff being imposed, if the moratorium is ended, it also gives the flexibility for every economist to impose their own policies, to impose their own tariff, which makes it hard for the businesses to do the business planning and to do the export, because then each of the economies will try to impose or will try to implement their own policies. Of course, we're all only talking about the potential risks and scenarios here, because it's not yet there's no tariff yet being imposed by Indonesian government. Currently, the Indonesian government is only requiring businesses to declare for every imported digital goods. And this alone already raised administrative burden, because then they're not used to do declaration of, because it's not like goods import, other raw material imported goods. They don't know, how do you define the source of the data from? How do you define the FOB, for instance? So it's still fairly new, this requirement. So this is what I'm saying when I say there is already administrative burden, because they're not yet used to declare digital goods import. So now it's currently being imposed, even though it's still 0% of tariff, but requiring the businesses to declare the importation of digital goods in order to collect the data. I think that's the main reason of the Indonesian government currently, because they wanted to see how is actually the dependence of the businesses towards the imported digital goods. So that's all I can say. That's based on our discussions. It's certainly because we are net importer of digital goods. There's no prominent digital goods players in Indonesia, so we are net importer. So based on that, I think the government is trying to collect the data, which is why the businesses is required and mandated to declare imported digital goods.
Well, collecting more data on this is obviously a good thing, as it is so broad, and that many countries interpret them slightly differently, and then it has only grown. So this is absolutely a good thing. The OECD studies shows, of course, on a global level, that a customs revenue on this would be very, very small compared to the costs. But it is hard to estimate. But then if you break that down to individual countries, it could be different depending on how you export and import. And you could understand that well, Indonesia is not small, so let's not only talk about Indonesia, but that developing countries in general are seeking for ways to generate important revenues, obviously. So how do you square that circle to find a way forward? Is it to do on the VAT basis, or is some sort of non-discriminatory tax alternatives in general? Have you looked at on this as well, Katrin?
Yes, I mean, it's definitely something that I have been diving into, and I will say it's complicated here too. I mean, I think that, as I mentioned earlier, these studies that are out there have pretty different results when it comes to what the impact is going to be. There's the OECD study that shows, as you said, a pretty, minimal impact on revenue foregone. There are some UNCTAD studies that show a much higher amount of revenue foregone, but it all kind of depends also on how that's being measured, on what they consider to not be taxed and what they think is going to potentially be taxed. And as I understand some of the OECD work too, they're saying that not everything is going to necessarily be taxed. So it gets a little bit complex, I think, when you get into the data. I mean, if we see, studies that range from the OECD, I think is 0.08%, right, to 0.3% is their kind of band, and then going up to 14.3 billion on another study. I mean, it's a pretty, and again, I mean, I think even with within some organizations, there are different studies. So it's a pretty big range. I think one of the things that's interesting, I wonder if you'll let me say a little bit about the regional dimension to this too, because I feel like that comes into this. I'll come back to the data point as well, but I think the regional part, the more that I get into it, I guess the more I find it to be sort of a fascinating aspect of this, because I think, first of all, we actually have some international law. It's not multilateral law, but we have some international law through these trade agreements on this topic. And to me, that's always really significant, because it means that we also have like some guardrails maybe, but there is this concern that Devi raised earlier too with fragmentation. Now, I think fragmentation can sometimes, I'm doing research that kind of looks at fragmentation from a different perspective, which is how can we learn from all of these different examples? the regional level, and what do they tell us about where we might go on this? So just a couple of quick points on that, and then I'll kind of come back to the data question. But I think the OECD has done some good work on this. 200 RTAs, as I understand, have provisions on this. And 56 WTO member states are party to an RTA that has provisions. So that's actually something that we should not overlook. Now, these are not always references to kind of making the moratorium binding, although that's the most common way that this is coming up in trade agreements. So I think out of their estimates, there are maybe 12 of the RTAs that are tying this to the outcome at the WTO, but most of them are actually making commitments on their own without tying it to the outcome at the WTO. So this means, again, that we get binding RTA law that can at least maybe help and avoid. Most of these, and this is partly to your question about alternatives, so most of these provisions don't apply to internal taxation. So countries still have the ability to decide how they want to tax internally, whether they want to do a VAT, whether they want to do something that's VAT-like. I mean, I think there are also studies on whether the VAT is a good model and whether it winds up being regressive or it's a better way of taxing, but it certainly is something that I think is being looked at. And I would just say again here, governments should be thinking about what's best in their circumstances. This should be fit for purpose, but they should also be consulting with these same companies that we're talking about in the multilateral context. They need to be part of that discussion. So whatever has to happen multilaterally to have engagement, I think it also has to happen at the domestic level. But as I understand, though, most of these RTA provisions apply only to content. They don't apply to the medium. There are still challenges with definition, though. And I think this is something that we just need to study more deeply. Like, what is the range of how this is defined at the regional level? But there are a lot of examples of binding commitments, CPTPP, Australia, Chile FTA, the AFC FTA, which I mentioned before, is
this
looking
is the
at
African for those
African.
of us, those of our listeners who are not in the alphabet soup. The CPTPP is the agreement between Canada, Chile, Peru, Australia, New Zealand, and a whole bunch of countries in Asia. The one that the US left. Japan is in as well. Indonesia is not. The AFCFTA is the African Free Continental Agreement, potentially covering the whole continent.
4 countries. I know.
Yeah, and then we have the DEPA, of course, which is the digital agreement between Singapore, New Zealand, Chile, and Canada, I think.
And I think South Korea is joining. I mean, there are some of these agreements are modular and countries can join onto them too, which is also significant, I think. But sorry about using these acronyms. So under the African Continental Agreement, there is a digital protocol right now that's in development. And my understanding is that this is also going to include a provision that maintains the moratorium. So I think this is actually really significant that this is coming up so much regionally, because I think that it actually maybe gives us a little bit of an opportunity to study what's happening there and to try to think about what the future could look like. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, these studies, I think, really do need to be taken into account more. It does strike me, though, that maybe we need to have I don't know, some way of kind of parsing through all of this too, to decide, well, is this really significant? And one other thing too, that I heard about a bit in Geneva is that some governments, and I think that India is one of these, are realizing that customs duties are not such a significant source of revenue for them either. So if they really want to think about this, they should be thinking about other ways of dealing with it rather than customs duties. So, I mean, it gets into all kinds of questions that governments, I think, are just going to have to really consider, but gets us right back to all these implications that we talked about before. If you do this in a certain way, it is going to have an impact on certain stakeholders. That I think we can tell. So the fact that we know that this is really going to impact MSMEs and SMEs, very significantly, and that it will impact women-owned businesses very significantly, to me just means we need to really step back and think much more about how to do this and what something could look like. And I just, all of this complexity and confusion around this just signals that it is much too premature to be making a decision on lifting the moratorium.
Indeed. So how do you see this possibility of different regional agreements? Indonesia is part of some, but not so many. But as a principle, is this a way forward. And there is, of course, also the discussion in the WTO of a plurilateral agreement on e-commerce, which has made significant progress on the easy things, but of course, then when you come into the more complicated issues, it's not about to be concluded soon.
I think, Cecilia, aside from the lack of the common understanding or the lack of definition of what is defined as electronic transmitted goods, I think we cannot negate the fact that digital goods, the impact of digital goods to SMEs or to businesses is evident. I mean, you can't deny the fact that the impact has been very much positive to businesses. So I think we need to be careful in terms of raising the barriers further. And currently, there's already a list of digital regulatory compliance that businesses has to comply. So I think we just need to be carefully assess the situation, and because the impact is significant. I mean, they use the digital goods in every step of the process of the value chain, from the core business process to supporting functions. So I think knowing the impact of digital goods and knowing how the micro scale businesses also use digital goods and services, we cannot deny the fact that this has been significant the impact for them. So any policies needs to be considered carefully.
Absolutely. And I mean, national decisions or even regional agreements, that is good, but the digital trade in itself is neither national or regional, it is global. So of course we see the risk, even if we can learn from different regional or bilateral agreements what's in there and how different countries and stakeholders approach this and define. There is the risk that this, if the moratorium fails to be renewed, that it results in a total chaos of different agreements that makes it very difficult. And we know if there's one thing small companies need, all companies need it, but especially very small companies, is predictability, not too much administration, and simple ways to access and to be able to do their business. So what do you think will happen in Abu Dhabi? What's your guess? What's your guess? Will it be prolonged again?
Which of us would you like to?
I want both of you to speculate on this.
Oh, I mean, it's always difficult to speculate, but I would say that my guess would be, again, given the discussions around this and given the fact that there are still so many questions, my guess is that it would be extended. That's my hope, that it would be extended. And I think you're right. I think that this does fit into a bigger context and on e-commerce, and that there is work that is underway there. And I think that, coming out of MC12, that there was reference to that work program. So I think that I think member countries are linking these pieces. I do want to highlight a couple of other things too that I think are significant on the WTO side. I think one is that the recent WTO World Trade Report really points to the fact that not all stakeholders are able to capture the benefits of multilateral trade equally, which again, I think is just what we're talking about here. And so that suggestion on thinking about globalization differently, a re-globalization, these studies that Devi and I are presenting, I feel like go straight to that point, that we really need to put this first through the lens of those who are going to be impacted. We need to go bottom up. We can't keep going top down. We say that we want to do things differently. I think we need a different approach if that is something that we're serious about. And it's interesting too, because I think looking at the documents coming out of MC12, there was reference to all of this too, inclusive, sustainable trade, these things, again, that we kind of use as these broad concepts without really having a sense of how exactly we're going to achieve them. I think here we have some ideas. If we're seeing that this has really such a strong impact on small businesses, I think we have to step back and try to figure out what would need to happen to make sure that those businesses are not impacted negatively. How could we do more study? How could there be more consultation? We learned a lot, I would say, too, doing the study that we did. And one thing that we really learned is there's no shortcut to getting this information from companies. You have to sit down and talk to them. You have to go out into the field and actually talk to people. You can't just do this by some kind of survey that you send out. And I thought that was really telling as well. And the fact that so many didn't feel that they had been engaged, and many of them also said that they didn't feel that their governments were representing their interests in international negotiations. So I think, again, it like kind of highlights the bigger challenge. But this to me seems like an example of something very concrete where we could start taking a different path. So I'm hopeful. I'm always hopeful, I think, but it does seem like there's enough uncertainty here that it kind of points towards we're not ready to do something about this. I don't know what Devi thinks or what you think, Cecilia, but that's my take on it.
Yeah, I don't have crystal ball to be able to say what will be the outcome. I would hope that they will extend the moratorium, knowing the significant impact of the digital goods to businesses. But I would say that I think we need more intensive engagement with the policymakers in terms of understanding the magnitude of the impact and what will be, because if it is imposed, then what will be the scenarios, then they need to understand this further. So I think laying out the fact and understanding the magnitude of it will be key steps that needs to be taken to be able to engage more with the policymakers.
Yeah, no, certainly, and we see an increased debate now as the clock is ticking, as we are approaching the date where the moratorium will fall unless there is an active decision. But a vast majority of the world's countries want it to be prolonged because they see that, from different points of view, obviously, but that it has been beneficial and that we do need to gather much more information and be clearer on definitions and the impact, especially on small and medium-sized companies. And as you said, all studies, even if they have different figures, they all point to the same phenomena, that small companies, micro companies even, companies led by women are those who would lose the most and who gains the most from the moratorium. And this is, of course, something that ministers need to take into consideration, but then we also know that WTO acts by consensus, and that has been really, really hard lately. There's quite a lot of questions coming in on this. I'll read a few from you. There is one, and I'll read it up. If, as you present, there is a strong economic rationale for renewing the moratorium, including for small and women-owned firms, how do we create the political conditions to enable its renewal at MC13? Well, that's that's very, very, very maybe hard for you to answer.
Yeah, it's very hard for me to
have a
this.
massive awareness raising campaign so that ministers who actually go there and their entourage are aware of what's actually at stake, because usually this has been like an miscellaneous question at the end. Oh, by the way, we need to renew the moratorium, and then there's a discussion, but that eventually it happens. But now, it is really critical, and as some countries are preparing, even if not go the whole way to introduce that legislation, at least to impose reporting requirements and so on, it is a kind of preparation for possibly adding tariffs. Do you have any views on this? I mean, you're obviously from your different organizations, university research councils, doing your best to influence policymakers.
Just a few quick thoughts to add. I agree with you. We need a massive conversation around this. A massive educational process has to happen on all sides. So I talked a lot about how small businesses feel about their interactions with government. 88% of the companies we surveyed said that the communication channels with government were not easily accessible. 88%. Very few of them said that they thought that the government properly represented their interests in international negotiations. So we see that we have this big gap. The flip side of this is that government, I talked about how companies feel, right? How the MSMEs feel about this, whether they knew anything, whether they felt they had been consulted. But the flip side is that government needs to understand better. All of these domestic governments need to understand what their stakeholders want and need. There needs to be more of a process for engaging with local stakeholders on this. I have been going to Geneva for many, many years, and it is a place where we gather and talk about trade issues, sometimes in a very in very minute detail, but I think we cannot lose sight of the fact that these things have actual implications for real people, for the companies, for their customers, and that needs to be part of the process. And so without having that engagement, but I think we just need to keep talking about it. I mean, I think that there's always surprise with some of these results that are coming out of these studies. Oh, really? This is what companies are saying, impacts them or will impact them. There's this much of a feeling that this is going to really, affect their competitiveness. And I think for every government too, those things really matter. You don't want to lose, you don't want companies that have found success in the digital space. You don't want that to go away. You want to be able to keep building that. And I think one of the things that has been interesting that I've seen too is that, in the past, I think that it seemed like a lot of the kind of business generation in some of these areas was coming from some of the OECD countries. I think that is starting to flip too. I think a lot of developing economies are seeing that these are the places where they can have success. And so if you put more complicated conditions, this I have seen across the board with every single area I have studied, the more complicated you make it for businesses, small businesses are not going to be able to deal. The big ones can always find a way, actually. Yeah. The big ones will always find a way through. The small ones will go out of business. And I think we really need to keep that in mind. But if this is a place where there's growth potential for a lot of economies and where small businesses are going to be hit hard, I feel like that has to be something that will resonate with policymakers. But the only way that that conversation is going to result in anything is if we really amplify it, because I don't think these discussions are happening enough. So I'm glad that we're doing this today. I hope there's more of this to come.
Yeah, well, obviously there's, as the clock is ticking, as I said, there's another question. You partly answered this. Tariffs on e-commerce should in principle be good news for those creating digital products in country which impose tariffs on imports. Are tech companies in India, Indonesia, etc., actively lobbying for the moratorium to end? Because of course, as this is so complicated, we have winners and losers as well. So if you're a big importing countries on this, there are of course revenues as well. Is there anything you are aware of where that big companies or small companies are lobbying for this? Have you seen any tendencies of this in your council, Devi?
Well, in Indonesia context, there's no tech, local or domestic tech players. So I don't know how to respond to this question, because lobby, there's no tech business. I mean, there's no prominent tech businesses, local tech businesses in Indonesia. So I don't think the businesses lobbying for the moratorium to end. They're lobbying for the moratorium to be continued. So that's all I can say to respond to that questions.
Yeah, and then there are several questions related to the WTO process as well. What happens with the inclusion on content in the definition like electronic transmissions? In WTO, there are different positions. Some countries exclude them or others include them. What's your opinion? Ideally, should content be included or not? Because obviously sometimes they are.
Yeah, in the recent regulatory requirement whereby the businesses is mandated to declare the imported digital goods, content, when it is under subscription, it is considered as digital services. Therefore, it doesn't have to be declared. So currently, it's just focusing on the non-content, the non-subscription software and applications that needs to be declared. That's when the recent regulation is imposed, and we still have yet to see whether this is effective or not, because it's still very recent. So I can't talk much about it, because we still have yet to see how the businesses comply to this requirement.
No, ideally in the global world, we would have a global moratorium that includes both digital services and goods and content as well, because this is what we're already dealing with. But some countries are including this, but not within the definitions. So we also have a question from Alan Wolf, an esteemed colleague here at Peterson and also a former deputy director of WTO. Is there a WTO obligation that would prevent a most favored nation response by one country to impose tariffs on e-commerce sourced from another most favored nation member that apply tariffs on its e-commerce? So are there costs that might exist for e-commerce exports from a country in the absence of the moratorium? That's a technical question. I don't know if you feel that you could answer that. Are you looking into the WTO laws on this, Catherine?
I mean, obviously, that's something that I do tend to focus on as well. So I'm just trying to make sure. And hello, Alan, it's good to get your question. And I'm sorry that I missed you the other day. So is there a WTO obligation that could deal with this if there were a non-MFN response from a country? So could you challenge this essentially if there were an approach that were outside of MFN? And I certainly think, yes, I do think that the WTO rules on non-discrimination are going to come into play here if something, if this is something that countries, I hope I understand the question correctly. The second part on cost may exist in the absence of the moratorium. So meaning if we do away with the moratorium, do we go to MFN? And I definitely think that there's a possibility there. Again, I think that we don't, without really kind of understanding how this is going to be applied by countries, it's very difficult to figure out what it's going to look like. But I do think that the WTO rules are going to have to come into play on this too. I was going to say earlier as well that I think that there are, and I'm probably not answering the question as fully as Alan would like, but I think he probably has a good answer to it. I'd like to hear his answer. I mean, I think that there has to be, so there have to be some implications for this. I don't think that it just becomes something that is a complete, anything goes. I don't see how that is possible. But I think that we just have all of these questions still. Again, I think that the regional dimension does come in a little bit as well, because if this is something that countries are agreeing to on a regional basis, again, it might not be the kind of full extent of what we would like to see. It's not going to bind everybody, but I think at least it gives us a sense of where countries feel like they should be bound by some of the rules. And I know too, going to your last question, Cecilia, on what positions countries are taking, there are a couple of different positions that are out there, that we maintain the moratorium and encompass both content and transmission, that it applies only to transmission and not to content. I mean, again, I think a lot of this has to be worked out. And then a number of countries are saying, that this gets deferred to the WTO membership and that countries have to maintain current practices. So I think there still is a great deal of kind of variation in the approaches that are being taken. But I think Alan's point is a really good one, and his question is a really good one, because we still have, we still resort to the basic rules, I think, no matter what happens. I just think it would be a shame, though, if we have to kind of go into this like uncharted territory on this without really having more time to study what the implications are going to be of lifting the moratorium.
Someone in the audience says that the answer to Alan Wolf's question is yes. But of course, I mean, considering that
I said that in a more roundabout.
Considering that most countries actually want to preserve it, including the big stakeholders, EU, China, US, etc., want to preserve it. So there has been, you never know if it is pushed to its extreme, but there is a handful of countries who do not want to prolong it. So of course the other ones would, if worst come to worst, in Abu Dhabi, saying that, okay, we don't want this anymore. The others would say, well, then we move on. And then you have to find a way, as you described, to do that, whether that is in a plurilateral agreement or whether that is in most favored nation and so on, to move on. There's also a question of, we talked a lot about the small companies and very small companies as well. Have you seen in this the big dragons, the Apples, the Amazons, the Microsofts? Are they present in this debate? Would you want them to be present? Because obviously they have a stake as well. Do you know this, Devi, Catherine?
Yeah, I think I see them. They're present in many of discussions, and then they're giving their perspective in terms of the use of and how they actually empower small and medium businesses. I would go back to the case in Indonesia. I mean, we have a lot of startups. I think Indonesia is one of digital land startups. And these startups, they're working together with these big tech companies. And as net importer of digital goods, I think their presence cannot be denied because of these big tech companies as well. The startup is mushrooming in Indonesia. So there is a mutually beneficial relationship between the Indonesian startups and these tech companies. But yeah, I see them being present in some of the public forum that I see in some of the WTO sessions.
Do you have a comment on this, Katrine?
So I would just say, I mean, of course, the big companies are going to be engaged in this. This is a huge issue, I think, for any company. And I would say that actually it's important to keep the big companies engaged in this too, because I think that all of these points about what's going to happen to the smaller companies, it's going to require the bigger companies being aware of that as well and figuring out some way that they can work with the companies and, you know, the smaller companies in their, you know, in their business chain. I mean, I think that there's no question that they're going to have a role to play and that they also need to be more aware of the impact that this is going to have on the smaller companies. Maybe there are things that the companies can also do to try to make sure. I mean, I think ultimately the governments are the ones that have to really think this through. But I think that the companies have a big role in all of this as well. So I feel like this is a conversation everybody needs to be having. I don't think that it's only the governments that need to be at the table. I think it's got to be the entire, you know, everyone affected by this. You had asked earlier too about consumers. And I mean, I think that's another important point that consumers are going to
how will I be affected?
Impacted by this? Well, I mean, you're probably going to wind up bearing a lot of the cost, right? I mean, I think if something changes, I think it's going to come to consumers. So we asked the small businesses we talked to this too, and over half of them said that they would pass on at least some of the cost, and then a percentage of them said they would pass on all of the administrative costs to their consumers, because I just don't think that they have a way of dealing with it. And again, you know, as I said before, the big companies are going to figure this out. The small companies are going to struggle more. And if the small companies are saying they don't have a choice but to pass it along to the consumers, I think we can kind of expect that this is something that consumers are going to have to bear the brunt of no matter what.
Any views on this, Devi?
Yeah, I think it will be interesting
with your observations as well.
I think it will be interesting to when I say that we need to engage more stakeholders and multi-stakeholders, it also involves the big tech companies as well as the smaller companies and how they use digital goods, so that the policymakers can also see the bigger picture on how this actually relate to each other, because they live in one big ecosystem, digital ecosystem that we're trying to create here. So if you're attacking one thing, it also affects the other parties. I would say intensifying discussions and engagement will be key in these matters, regardless whether there's a common consensus with regards to definition and classification of digital goods. I think this intensive engagement needs to happen in place and involving multi-stakeholders.
Well, thank you so much. It is clear that we need to talk much more about this. We need a massive awareness raising all over the world. We need to gather the data that we have, which and it complicates the pedagogy with this, because it is, you know, it is not very, very clear. You can't measure exact figures, the effects of it, because of the different definitions and the different speculations on how exactly it will impact. But I think all studies that I have read, at least, and the ones that you are referring to as well, point to that especially smaller companies would be affected, because it will create more bureaucracy, more burden, more administration, more costs, and more lack of predictability, which is so important for small countries. And ideally, as you said, we live in a digital ecosystem here, and you can't put borders, physical borders to that. So we do need to have something, ideally international, if that's not possible, regional, but moving forward. And there's very little time left. So hopefully ministers will realize that they need to sit down, not only to prolong, but also sit down and seriously try to address the definition and the scope issues, because this is not going to be easier in the future as the digital economy grows. So Professor Katrine Kuhlman, Thank you so much for being here. Devi Ariyani from the Indonesia Service Dialogue Council. Thank you for helping us to understand this. Thank you for the work that you are doing to raise the awareness level of this. And thank you, all of you who have been listening and tuned in. Have a very nice afternoon or day or evening, wherever you are. Goodbye.
Thank you. My pleasure. Bye-bye.